you've joined us for our first Vienna Animal Studies online event. And we couldn't be more delighted to have Professor John Sanbonmatsu with us as our inaugural speaker to discuss themes from his timely and impactful and incredible book, The Omnivore's Deception, published in 2025. John Sanbonmatsu is professor of philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, where he teaches courses in ethics, politics and existentialism, philosophy of technology, and other topics. He is the author of The Omnivore's Deception, What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and Ourselves, and that was published by NYU Press, and also of The Postmodern Prince, Critical Theory, Left Strategy, and the Making of a New Political Subject, published by Monthly Review Press. He's also the editor of the book Critical Theory and Animal Liberation by Bloomsbury. His opinion essays have appeared in the Christian Science Monitor, CounterPunch, Huffington Post, and St. Louis Post-Dispatch, among other places. Today in his talk, Professor John Sanbonmatsu draws on themes from his book, The Omnivore's Deception, to analyze the existential dimensions of speciesism as a mode of production. While human supremacism shares many points of intersection and commonality with other systems of power and oppression, its status as the universal basis of human metabolism and identity, both personal and collective, makes it unlike any other system. Professor Sanbonmatsu will discuss prospects for new existential politics organized around the defense of terrestrial life. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Sanbonmatsu. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Sapora. I want to thank the organizers for bringing me here, Claudia and Ari and Zipporah and Carlo and others. And I also want to give a shout out to Zipporah for this particular book of mine, which would not have been written unless, except for the fact that Zipporah helped me as my writing coach. So just want to say that from the beginning, although she's not responsible for the weaknesses in this book. What I want to give a kind of informal talk. I don't want to give a lecture per se. I thought I would, since people on this call, this Zoom today, are already, I think, familiar with animal studies and what's happening on the earth to non-human animals at our hands. I thought I would just talk a little bit about the origins of my book and then why I wrote it, what I hoped it would do, and then draw on a few of these themes that Sapora just alluded to, about existential themes. So this book, first of all, grew out of a lifetime of really dismal arguments between myself and hundreds of other people about veganism and animal ethics and so forth, whether students or people in what we might call mainstream society, family, friends, everybody in this space, I'm sure, has had similar experiences. Whenever the question of human violence towards animals comes up, we find a whole set of defensive reactions, which in themselves signal quite clearly that there's something significant at stake in this debate, that people have such a defensive posture, and that this defensive posture, of course, is universal. My training in graduate school was it was an interdisciplinary degree that I have. So I've studied philosophy, political theory, and critical sociology, Marxism, and so forth. And it was out of that training that I began to look at the animal issue from the systemic point of view, particularly as a form of totality. Now, totality, of course, is a concept that we find in Marxist thought. It's the idea that there's a coherence to capital, and that coherence leads it to colonize all aspects of consciousness and culture. Right, begins as a mode of material production, and then that ends up leading to ideological production. So that I think that framework ends up coloring my approach to these questions. My book, in a certain sense, can be read as an attempt to come to terms with and deconstruct certain systems of legitimacy or legitimation that allow the hegemonic order to continue and reproduce itself, right? And the two leading forms of contradiction that I describe in this total system of human supremacism, which is intertwined with capital, are the first of all the metabolic rupture between Homo sapiens and the Earth. The idea of a metabolic rupture comes from John Bellamy Foster, but it's the notion that our species is contraindicated in a certain sense with the survival of many of the other organisms here. And everyone knows that we are already entering a period of total ecological collapse, right? That all the animals on the earth are dying. The fresh water is disappearing. The oceans are becoming too warm to support life, coupled with, of course, what is euphemistically called overfishing, but in fact is merely a campaign of extermination in the world's oceans. So that's the kind of first contradiction that's embedded in this structure. And another that's related to that and comes out of that is the disjuncture between, on the one hand, kind of the liberal Enlightenment norms and ideals that have sat atop this structure of violence and exploitation for centuries. Ideals of reasonableness, moral autonomy, freedom, and so forth. And on the other hand, grotesque violence, coercion, suffering, and the infliction of death on humans as well as non-humans. So these contradictions have deepened, particularly the ecological one, and it is because of these kind of instabilities within the system that we see the emergence of new, insistent narratives of legitimation, new ways to stabilize the order. When I discuss a mode of legitimation, of course I'm referring to Habermas in a kind of general sense, but the way I'm thinking of this is simply a kind of conjunctural putting together a confluence of discourses and symbology and rationales to paper over contradiction. One of the things I talk about at length in my book, although it's spread out over the book, is the use of Orwellian terms to reconcile opposites. So maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of the genesis of this particular book, from around the early 2000s or so, I began noticing in the New York Times, which I've been reading for 50 years or so, these insistent narratives around humane meat, cage-free eggs, pasture-raised beef, and so forth. This is a discourse that I'm sure most of you or all of you are quite familiar with. And but it was peculiar that the editors at the Times thought this stuff was so newsworthy that they kept producing hundreds of these articles year after year. And the bellwether of all of this and the watershed moment, of course, was Michael Pollan's publication of The Omnivore's Dilemma, A Natural History of Four Meals in 2006. My book, of course, The Omnivore's Deception, is meant as an answer partly to Michael Pollan's work. Now, when you get involved in a project such as mine for years, you can maybe you run the risk of exaggerating the influence of the folks that you're going after in your critique. But I really don't think it's easy. It would be easy to exaggerate the importance of Michael Pollan as the go-to figure in American discourse for anything having to do with food politics, anything having to do with animal agriculture. And even though Pollan has moved on now, he wrote a book on hallucinogens, and now he has a new book out on the nature of consciousness. His book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, is still taught at practically every level of the American educational curriculum. I mean, it's taught to middle schoolers. It's part of state mandated curricular materials in different places in the United States. It's taught at the graduate level. It's taught in dozens of different disciplines, from writing and rhetoric to food politics, food studies, agricultural science, and so forth. Now, in a way, the nothing that Pollan says was new. But what he did was he put together a kind of neat intellectual package that took as its aim, the stabilization of the idea of meat and of animal agriculture as a whole. So a good portion of his book is actually an attack on animal rights. I mean, a significant uh, portion of the book, and that common sense, as it were, that he helped create, has really, I think, made it very difficult for the animal advocacy movement to chip away at the fundamental structures that legitimate the animal system. Now, in a certain sense, Pollan represents, an elite view. That's whom he's speaking to, is like the elite class. It's the Jeffrey Epstein files class, to some extent. And then beneath that, the college-educated middle class intelligentsia, centrists and liberals mostly. Um, the working class doesn't need to read Pollan because they already have been acculturated into a kind of common sense around natural hierarchy between humans and non-humans. But within the intelligentsia, there's been a kind of growing uneasiness for decades about these contradictions in the system. The idea that, well, we're not treating animals well, this factory farming is bad, and then, of course, the meltdown of the planet. So there had to be some effort, a series of efforts, to prop up a system in decline. So I don't think that, even though it's true that Pollan, it may not. I don't know if he's really read in Europe. I'd be interested to hear in the question and answer period whether that's true. But certainly in the U.S., he's still read widely. In fact, I looked on Amazon at his book, and The Omnivore's Dilemma, now 20 years later, is still in the top 10 best national bestsellers for food politics. It's quite extraordinary for a book to have that kind of evergreen life. So it's still doing its legitimation work. It's kind of and Penguin, which publishes Omnivore's Dilemma, has a whole like franchise of curricular materials and children's books and things to keep the juggernaut going. So why do we have uh, this whole system to kind of paper over these contradictions? Well, I've already answered that, but let me talk. I want to give a quote from my book, which is, to me, it kind of sums up the problem that I'm trying to take on in this work. I write, the contradiction between these two ways of living a human life, one lived in communion and love with animals, the other in violent contempt of their very lives, runs like an unmapped seismic fault beneath society, tracing the boundary of two irreconcilable value structures and modes of life. One might think that such blatantly contradictory attitudes and behaviors would provoke public debate or personal soul searching, but the opposite is true. Since everything is permitted in our treatment of other beings, every kindness and every barbaric horror, our behavior towards animals is seen to be a matter of aesthetics or personal taste, not ethics. The case for respecting animals' lives and caring for animals is held to be no stronger than the case for subjecting them to trauma and death, and society makes no attempt to reconcile the two. Like waves of equal amplitude traveling in opposite phases, our contradictory attitudes and behaviors towards animals are thought to cancel each other out. What is peculiar about this way of thinking about animals is that in no other domain of moral life would we accept such obvious contradictions in our values and behavior. No one would say that child abuse is the same thing as good parenting, or that throwing an elderly person down a flight of stairs is, quote, neither better nor worse than helping them across the street. Yet vis-a-vis other animals, one set of practices is held to be as good as another. To render these contradictory behaviors opaque to itself, society then resorts to Orwellian language, equating the enslaving of animals with freeing them, killing them with caring for them. Only in challenging these conceptual soporifics, I argue, can we hope to awaken from our deep moral slumber. Let me give you an example from the book of the way Michael Pollan is kind of spinning a web of legitimacy around this system, using a very skillful rhetoric that mobilizes symbols that go back thousands of years. And in this passage, I want to discuss Nazism, or in passing anyway, to talk about the aestheticization of violence as one of the tools of legitimation. So I talk about Rudolf Hess, everyone's favorite. Rudolf Hess, before joining the Nazis and rising in their ranks to become SS Kommandant of Auschwitz, had been part of the proto-fascist Back to the Land agrarian movement known as the Ardaman League. In his autobiography, published after his execution for crimes against humanity, Hess describes the killing at the Auschwitz death camp in pastoral terms. Quote, in the spring of 1942, hundreds of blossoming people walked beneath the blossoming fruit trees of the farmstead, most of them never guessing they were on their way to the gas chambers and to death. I can still see this image of growth and decay quite clearly. In her book, Eichmann Before Jerusalem, scholar Bettina Stangneth remarks of this passage, thinking about the eternal cycle of growth and decay made the extermination of millions of people into a natural occurrence and the murderers into a force of nature, the right hand of natural law, unquote. Hess aestheticized mass killing, passing off a deliberate policy to murder millions of innocent people as a thing of beauty, merely part of the natural cycle of life. Today we find a similar aestheticization of mass killing in omnivorous discourse, as when Michael Pollan praises Soliton's farm for offering a view of, quote, the whole cycle of birth, growth, death, and decay, unquote. Eager to participate in Soliton's death dealing, both because he is, quote, curious, he writes, and because he wants to know, quote, if I could bring myself to do it, unquote. Pollan personally slits the throats of dozens of chickens, blankly watching their violent spasms as they die. Absorbed in, quote, the rhythm of the work, Pollan finds that he's able to, quote, kill without a thought to anything but my technique, to the point where he, quote, got fairly good at it. In a rare moment of self-awareness, he acknowledges that, quote, the most morally troubling thing about killing is that after a while it is no longer morally troubling, unquote. Such psychic numbing, as psychologist Robert J. Lifton termed it, is also well documented among perpetrators of war crimes. Pollan wonders idly if the chickens he's killing smell the blood or, quote, recognize the knife in the hands of their killers, but he shrugs off the question, saying, quote, I have no idea. My late friend Karen Davis, however, who spent more than 3 decades living with and caring for chickens, believed that chickens are well aware of what is being done to them and others. Lest anyone think that chickens don't mind hearing and seeing other chickens die violently in front of them, she wrote, nothing could be further from the truth, unquote. Pollan, though, is too immersed in killing the animals to have, quote, much time for these reflections because you're working on an assembly or really disassembly line, unquote, which, quote, has a rhythm of its own that soon overpowers your mind as well as your body, unquote. Occasionally, the sinister nature of the workings of Polyphae's farm intrudes upon Pollan's pastoral idyll when a death smell, as he calls it, rises up from the rotting flesh, his words, of the compost piles. But the pleasure Pollan takes at mealtime smothers any faint stirrings of conscience. Quote, thankfully, all of that, the killing cones too, had retreated to the mental background for me, chased by the smoky, sweet aromas of the meal, which I found myself thoroughly able to enjoy, unquote. Only when the birds are dead do they truly come alive in Pollan's prose in aestheticized descriptions of their corpses. Quote, viscera is unexpectedly beautiful, glistening in a whole palette of slightly electric colors, from the steely blue striations of the heart muscle to the sleek milk chocolate liver to the dull mustard of the gallbladder, unquote. So this heightened language, which aestheticizes death and suffering, was, of course, received with open arms by the reading public, the educated public. It still is. And people who read Pollan's book, the violence in this book, where Pollen literally goes out of his way to inflict death and suffering on animals. He goes into the woods with a high-powered rifle and kills a mother pig, probably causing her piglets to starve. It simply goes unremarked by the general reader because he's playing to the mob. And this is a really important part of the mass psychology of speciesism, right? That Pollen's work of legitimation is only possible because there's a susceptibility in the people reading the book to having their bad faith reinforced. And that's one of the themes I talk about in my book is Sartre's notion of bad faith. Well, as I was working on this book, I found, interestingly, that the kinds of arguments, the kinds of rationales that we are seeing today in defense of the new animal agriculture, regenerative animal agriculture, sustainable, supposedly sustainable and humane animal slaughter and raising animals and so forth, that these arguments were, on the one hand, there was some novelty to them, but they also were hearkening back to quite ancient rationales, some going back centuries, but some literally ancient, going back thousands of years. For example, as everybody knows, animals are still figured in discourse as machine-like, so a Cartesian view. In my book, I quote the hunter-farmer Wes Jackson, who has a conversation with Pollen, and Wes Jackson, who, by the way, is lionized widely on the left and on in regenerative animal agriculture circles as a kind of naturalist sage. He says the following to Pollen, quote, "This is the sort of farm machinery I like." And he writes this of a pig that he and Pollen sit watching together on Joel Salatin's farm. Because an animal, quote, "never needs its oil changed, appreciates over time, and when you're done with it, you eat it," unquote. Animal machines have the additional benefit, I write, of being reproducible. While a, quote, "pregnant mare at work is growing her replacement," Jackson notes elsewhere, one, quote, "does not come out in the morning and find a little baby tractor," unquote. Barbara Kingsolver, the American writer, similarly compared animals in Animal Vegetable Miracle, which came out in 2007, to, quote, "four-legged tools," describing them as, quote, "human property, not just legally, but biologically." So here we find this peculiar melding together of two quite old ways of thinking about animals. One is the Cartesian view of animals as machines, but also this prior, much more ancient conception of animals as slaves. And so that's been surprising to me, I think, in studying the way that these rationales have been circulating and the kinds of tropes that they draw on, that we find a return of the repressed animal origins of this discourse in slavery, and then, of course, the animal domestication, which gave rise to slavery. Particularly, I want to note Aristotle's conception of the relationship between master and slave as one of friendship. The idea is that the animals we exploit benefit from this arrangement, that in a certain sense they consent to it, and so forth. So, in the broadest sense, my book is a form of ideology critique. I think it's really important to understand how arguments circulate within the political economy of knowledge. As I tried to emphasize, the kinds of rationales that we read in someone like Temple Grandin or Barbara Kingsolver, on the one hand, they're kind of echoing just the common sense, the background common sense of society, which everybody understands, and that's why it's like as I say, it's like playing to the mob. But at the same time, it has to be couched at in a higher key. It has to be seemingly more intellectually, if not rigorous, more plausible. And I think this stuff is very dangerous for that very reason. The other part of my purpose, I think, in writing this book was to perhaps go beyond or advance some of the literature in reframing the animal system and human violence in existential terms. And what do I mean by that? Well, I begin the book by talking about the ecological crisis. That that link between what we do to animals in animal agriculture and fishing and what we do to animals in just general capitalist production is something that I think we can and need to be spending more time talking about. This issue is existential in the very real sense that our structures of exploitation are leading to the collapse of the planet's ecosystem. I don't think there's another force as damaging to the ecology of our planet as the animal system, particularly because it's driving the mass species extinction crisis. So the system is existential in the sense that it's threatening our existence and the existence of other beings. It's existential in the Sartrean sense of bad faith, and I want to read another quote from my book about this very point. One of the more important texts for me in kind of conceiving of this project was Sartre's book Anti-Semite and Jew, which he wrote in the aftermath of the Second World War, in an attempt to come to terms with the continuing ubiquity of anti-Semitic beliefs in France. This is even after the Holocaust. People, of course, weren't calling it the Holocaust at the time, but it was widely known that Jews were persecuted specifically for being Jewish, along with Roma and others, and that they died in the millions in the concentration camps. And of course, the Vichy government should have delegitimated anti-Semitism. But Sartre's point in a kind of phenomenology of anti-Semitism is that the hatred of Jews isn't simply an idea or an opinion. It's a whole way of living a life. It's a whole way of structuring one's identity. And that is what we find with the animal system. I've described the animal system as a totalizing system, a set of material relations, a mode of production, a mode of producing human life. And because of that, it's a way of producing existence in the broadest possible sense. So I write in my chapter on Nazism, I suggested that our treatment of animals is not merely wrong, but a form of radical evil. There is indeed no other term adequate to the scale of the extreme violence we inflict on the other beings or the suffering that results from it. Nor is there another word that more aptly captures the horror of our own existential condition, which rests upon a universal crime in which we are all implicated, yet to which we are all indifferent. Sartre observed that while many anti-Semites, quote, would not do the Jews the least harm themselves, unquote, they also, quote, would not raise their little fingers to protect them from violence, unquote. Likewise, though many people would declare themselves against, quote, factory farms, few would bother to raise their little fingers on behalf of the animals trapped within them. Most are instead content to coast along without questioning how the chicken or pork on their plates got there. The anti-Semite, Sartre writes, chooses to find his being entirely outside himself, disappearing into the hateful mob in order not, quote, to look within. Quote, what he flees even more than reason is his intimate awareness of himself, unquote. Speciesism likewise shifts our gaze outward, away from moral reflection and self-knowledge. In our unchecked supremacy over other beings, we thereby apprehend ourselves as what we are not, the world's, quote, only intelligent life form, and the only being whose existence has worth, while pretending what we are not, that we are not what we are, animals ourselves. In short, we use both our differences from other animals and our similarities to them as justification for our violence against them. As Mephistopheles observes to God in Goethe's Faust, the little god of earth remains the same queer sprite as on the first day or in primal light. His life would be less difficult, poor thing, without your gift of heavenly glimmering. He calls it reason, using light celestial, just to outdo the beasts in being bestial. If, as Sartre claims, anti Semitism is fear of the human condition, the same can be said of speciesism. We refuse responsibility for our freedom, telling ourselves that we have no choice but to go on hurting and killing the other beings, when instead we could choose compassion over violence. We choose speciesism, so to say, and in so doing, we choose ourselves, but for the worse. The existential basis of our identity in mass violence, in a vast injustice as great or greater than any other injustice, suggests there's something really chillingly, troublingly wrong about the human condition and the way that we organize not only our identities but our systems of meaning themselves. I think that we are at kind of a conjuncture that's interesting historically because the meta narratives that have long propped up the world capitalist system are kind of becoming undone. They're becoming unglued. Unfortunately, that is right now leading to the rise of populist right wing movements and neo fascism. But there is an opening, perhaps, that's been created for challenging the most fundamental structures of civilization. I mentioned the Epstein files, where the Epstein files have revealed what many of us knew all along, which is that the entire system is corrupt. It isn't even just about political ideology, right? It's the wealthy elite who control everything and have no moral scruples whatsoever, particularly the men, and particularly men from the northern countries. Um, so just to kind of wrap up here, because I do want to leave room for questions and your observations about any of this. When I was thinking about what to say today, I did want to make a bid for kind of reconceiving what we do as animal advocates in these kind of broader terms of not merely animal ethics, not merely, as I called it, ideology critique of laying bare the system, but seeing in ourselves, in our advocacy, the germ of a new civilization. I always return to Antonio Gramsci and his view of counter-hegemonic leadership, which is to say the idea that the left needs to conceive itself as a force of civilizational reform through what he called moral and intellectual uh, leadership, which is to say creating a new common sense. Now, the problem for our side is that 99% of humanity, perhaps, is speciesist thoroughly. And even though, objectively speaking, our commitment to that project is destroying the conditions of life on the earth, not to mention creating new vectors of disease like avian flu and so forth, and adverse health outcomes, right, from animal diets. Notwithstanding that, most people think that it's necessary that we continue to eat animals and that we benefit from it. So that structure, meanwhile, is reinforced every hour of the day by the capitalist world system, which tells us that we have to keep doing this. I want to conclude uh, when I kind of get around to the end of this book here. I get to this point where I talk about something a little bit more positive. I did that partly for the publisher because I'm not the most optimistic sort of person, but I think in thinking through the possibility of what I've described as an existential politics, I think that this passage kind of alludes to it. It doesn't really spell it out, but yeah, it was actually Zipporah Weisberg and I who took a trip up to Vine Sanctuary, or rather, I accompanied Dr. Weisberg up there for some research that she was going to be doing about the sanctuary, and she's written on this herself. But Vine Animal Sanctuary, for those who don't know, is a nonprofit sanctuary in Vermont that's not typically open to the public. It's run by Patrice Jones. It was founded by Patrice and Miriam Jones, and they conceive of the sanctuary along, very progressive feminist lines. So let me just read a little bit about this and then open it up for questions. At first glance, Vine has the appearance of an ordinary working farm with much of the traditional farm work of feeding and providing water for the animals, patching fences, and shoveling chicken waste. Unlike on a working farm, however, none of the animals on Vine are there to produce or to be slaughtered for humans. Instead, Vine is a haven for animals escaped or rescued from the animal industrial complex, chickens saved from factory farms and misguided school egg hatching projects, pigeons saved from canned hunts, cows rescued from the butcher. The sanctuary is consciously organized around LGBTQ, feminist, and ecological principles. Among other things, this means that the animals aren't condescended to, but treated as co equals within the community. The sanctuary's governing principle of nonviolent ecological community is meanwhile extended as well to the adjacent woodlands and fields. Unlike traditional farms and ranches, Vine doesn't treat neighborhood animals as, quote, pests to be exterminated. Here, there are no traps or poisons, not even for the rats who pilfer the seeds and corn set out for the chickens each morning. So we had some really interesting conversations with the folks who work there, including a woman named Rachel, who's a Vermont native. And she, originally took a job at Vine simply because she needed a job, but then as she began to live alongside of these other animals, she began to notice something. Everything changed in the first week or so, she told us. Watching the birds, watching the mammals, watching everybody, just the way they interacted with one another, the way they interacted with us, I was like, what am I doing? Before, she thought of chickens as all alike. Now she began to see them as unique individuals. Rachel told us about a hen named C who had been rescued from an egg laying operation. Another hen from the same facility had arrived at Vine at the same time, and the two birds had remained close companions. Quote, when C passed away, Rachel recounted, her friend mourned her. She kept on going to the corner where she would always snuggle up in the shavings or the straw, just sit there and make this noise that I'd never heard before. And I've heard many noises come out of these birds. It was like she was crying. It was so sad. You have some birds that grow a bond with each other and love one another, and then you have some that are just like people. Today, Rachel no longer eats meat or other products from animals. I was completely wrong, she told us. I was misled. Many people fear that a world without meat, dairy, eggs, and fish would be one without pleasure, perhaps even without purpose. If the visitor to Vine would be hard pressed to say what is missing from the rich, purposeful lives of the staff there. Vine is a struggling nonprofit, and its personnel are underpaid. Yet even staff who have been on site for many years remain excited about their work. We found them eager to share their experiences with us. And because everything the staff does is grounded in a genuine ethos of care rather than in the illusion of care, the work at Vine has an existential and moral authenticity that one never encounters on a working animal farm. For here there is no violence and hence no betrayal. We have come to view our relations with other animals as a zero sum game, fearing that to promote their interests is to threaten or diminish ours. But Vine and similar experiments show us what we ourselves stand to gain in addressing other beings as thous rather than as its, as persons rather than things. Standing outside the barn that afternoon at Vine, watching the goats lazing about in the shade to escape the summer heat, the guinea fowl chasing one another through the tall grass, the cows nudging the staff for neck rubs, we felt we had caught a glimpse of the peaceable kingdom, the lineaments not of some mythic Eden, still less of a fraudulent past golden era of animal agriculture, but of a more advanced civilization, a future society which, having chosen to bury its whips, prods, and chains, to dismantle its slaughterhouses, and to recall its trawlers, had won for itself the higher spiritual goods of compassion, mercy, and love. Now, having read this passage at other talks, I think what strikes me reading at this time is the disjuncture, right, between our dream of a world in which humans uh, and non-humans lived in a kind of nonviolent harmony, in which humans saw themselves as helpers of other beings rather than as their exploiters. The disjuncture between that kind of beautiful, really kind of religious vision on the one hand, and then the reality of these totalitarian systems of death and trauma, and then the ideological mediations that serve to ensure its existence in perpetuity. That disjuncture, of course, it leads us all into a kind of despair, individually within the movement. And I know, not everybody is perhaps as pessimistic as I am about prospects for change, but the fact is that the kind of the practices and stories that we've told ourselves for many generations about possibility of human progress, of the perfectibility of the human uh, species, these Renaissance humanist ideals, the more recent idea of a liberal world order, beginning with the League of Nations through the United Nations and so forth, the idea that humans could order themselves in some kind of way as to prevent the repeat of genocide and that sort of thing. All the illusions are kind of uh, coming out into the open, being revealed as illusions. So that's just something, I guess I'll just end there, just to maybe that's something we can talk about, how we reconcile the visions that we have, the ambitions we have for our movement with the kind of civilizational reform that I've described as being necessary. And with that, the foundation of a new existence for our species in defense of life, because that is what is being extinguished as we meet here today. It's the extinguishing of all life on Earth. Well, thank you very much for your attention on to this.
Thank you so much, John. That was extremely powerful as always, and reminded me of just how important your book is, how deep it goes into these fundamental questions that are missed or not addressed to the same extent as they are in your book. The thing that strikes me the most about it is the total critique. You address and explore and reveal the psychopathological elements of this attachment to violence, to extermination, to domination. You also look at the political institutional elements of legitimation, cultural elements of legitimation. And you don't provide us with the answer, because if only we had the answer, right, then we wouldn't be having this conversation, because we'd be getting to work fixing things. But you leave us at the end with this glimpse into possibility, and with the questions that we have to sit with, this discord between kind of what could be, what is happening in places like Vine and other sanctuaries, and what is also happening across 99% of the earth, among 99% of humanity. So that discomfort is important. It's important that, as you do in your book, you remind us of that discomfort, that we don't get complacent in our advocacy, in our theorizing, in our comfortable academic positions, that we don't distance ourselves, which can be a tendency, because it's so painful and traumatic, from the brutal reality of, as what you've pointed out, as well as part of the total critique, that it reaches us on an existential level. And you also, very importantly, lay out for us, the different layers of what's existential about this, right? So the threatening of our existence, that's existential on one hand. The bad faith element is existential. The structuring of identity. So I have some questions for you around that, but I want to open the floor to others first. And I just want to let everybody know how we're going to proceed with this. So we'd love it if you could turn your cameras on, so that we have a more collegial atmosphere, so that John is speaking to faces. If possible, I will be moderating the people who would like to speak. And those of you who would like to put your questions or comments into the chat, Ariana will be taking care of that. I'd like to start first with anybody who would like to ask John a question directly, and or comment on his talk or the book if you've had a chance to look at it yet. So just click the